Good evening. We welcome you to this conversation on behalf of Menno Media, Mennonite Church USA, and Mennonite Church Canada, whether you are joining us live or watching us later on YouTube. We are so glad that each of you joined us this evening, and we're glad that we have so many Mennonites and ecumenical siblings joining us today. This is such an important conversation. We're glad you're here, and we are so pleased to have all of our wonderful panelists who can turn on your videos and get ready to be introduced in a little bit. But first, to begin, we would like to acknowledge the land we occupy and the people who have lived here before us, even as we gather as we are from many different locations. If you have voices together, you can join me in reading number 878, or you can listen as I read. We acknowledge that we are gathering on the traditional territory of Indigenous peoples. We affirm that settlers have specific responsibilities in the journey of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. We give thanks to Creator and to those peoples who have stewarded this land for generations. We are grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and worship here as we witness the reconciling movement of the Spirit and seek to live into right relations with our Indigenous neighbors and all of creation. My name is Katie Graber, and I join you this evening from Columbus, Ohio, traditional territory of Delaware, Miami, and Osage people.
My name is Annalie Leptison, joining you from Ottawa, Ontario, traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. If you are joining us live, you are welcome to use the chat functions to introduce yourself as well. If you would like to look up what groups of Indigenous people have lived where you live now, Native Land is a great website to do that on, and the link is in the chat.
You can also use the Q&A function if you have a question that you would like panelists to speak to. We've prepared some questions for our panelists to begin with, and we invite you to submit questions as well. The Q&A function keeps questions organized for us while the chat can scroll up and get lost. So it's really helpful if you use the Q&A. This webinar is also being recorded, and it will be posted sometime next week on the Menno Media YouTube channel and the Voices Together website, and those links will be in the chat. You can find those next week. You can find other launch event recordings and other resources about Voices Together in those locations as well.
Our centering for our time this evening can be found in Voices Together at number 851. It's a prayer written by Joanna Harrider, a Mennonite pastor in Kansas. If you have a copy of Voices Together handy, you may read along with the people part. Jesus calls us to praise and prayer, to song and silence.
Jesus calls us to worship.
Jesus calls us to hearing and healing, to service and solidarity.
Jesus calls us to love.
Jesus calls us to advocacy and action, to protest and provision.
Jesus calls us to justice.
We hear the call of Christ.
We worship together with joy.
This prayer ends with the line, "We worship together with joy," after being called to action and to justice. This is what we're going to hear about this evening, how our words and songs in worship can contribute to justice and to dismantling racism. We have a wonderful group of people with us to talk about many aspects of this work, and I'll introduce them briefly before we start in with the questions. Cheryl Bear from the Nadli-Wooten First Nation is a multi-award-winning singer-songwriter who shares stories of Indigenous life through story and song. She holds doctorate and Master of Divinity degrees and is an associate professor at Regent College in Vancouver, BC. She is a founding board member of Indigenous learning community NAITS and is currently serving as a strategic associate as the Indigenous Relations Specialist with Canadian Baptist.
Sorry, that part has changed. Sorry, I'm the community minister for First United Church in Vancouver on the downtown east side. Sorry.
No, that's great. Thank you for the update. Cheryl's not Mennonite, but has been a part of Mennonite Hope for the Future events, and we appreciate her adding her ecumenical perspective in addition to her other areas of expertise. Tony Brown is artist in residence and peace ambassador at Heston College and was part of the committee that compiled and edited Hymnal, a worship book. He uses music and story to promote peace and justice around the world. He believes that music can be a useful tool to bring people together across the various divides that have separated us for much too long. Andrea Davila was born and raised in Mexico, but has lived and studied in both the USA and Canada. She currently resides in Winnipeg, Manitoba, where she serves as an associate pastor at Sergeant Ave Mennonite Church. And Andrea consulted for the Voices Together process on Spanish language worship resources. Geraldine Balzer is an associate professor of curriculum studies in the College of Education at the University of Saskatchewan. Her experiences teaching Inuit students led to her interest in decolonizing pedagogies and transformative education. Her teaching focuses on ways of disrupting the hegemony of standard English and embracing the diversity of Englishes within the world, incorporating Aboriginal and post-colonial literature into secondary classrooms and preparing teachers to be advocates of social justice. She was part of the Voices Together consultant group on materials related to Indigenous communities. Finally, Melissa Florer-Bixler is the pastor of Raleigh Mennonite Church and a graduate of Duke University and Princeton Theological Seminary. She spent time studying in Israel, Palestine, Kenya, and England. She is the chair of L'Arche, North Carolina, and a steering committee member in broad-based organizing in her county. Melissa's writing has appeared in Christian Century, Sojourners, G's, Anabaptist Witness, The Bias, Faith and Leadership, and Anabaptist Vision. Melissa was part of the Central Practices Worship Resources writing team. So welcome to all of you. We are so glad you're part of this conversation.
All right, let's jump in with our first question. This first question is for Cheryl and Geraldine. Voices Together is the first Mennonite hymnal and perhaps the first or one of the first ecumenical hymnals to include a land acknowledgement, which we read together a little bit earlier. Can you talk about the significance and the limitations of land acknowledgements and how communities can best engage this resource? Cheryl, could you start?
Absolutely, thank you. I'll just start off the way I normally do. Hadikstuanda, Cheryl Bear, Natle Westend, and Denusli. My name is Cheryl Bear, and I'm from the beautiful village of Natle Westend First Nation in BC. Thanks for the question. I think that the land acknowledgement is it's very important to me as an Indigenous person, because as I remember when I was in grade 6, and my teacher at the time, and I'm 52 years old right now, so this is going way back. The teacher got up one day and said, "This term we're going to be studying Indians in Canada." And so myself, I was in a all-white school, and there was and one other Indigenous student in there with me. And we kind of looked at each other like, "Oh my goodness, this is kind of cool, right? This is us." And grade 6 girls. And but as soon as the teacher said that, just seconds went by, and he said, "Studying Indians in Canada, but we're going to study the Hurons in Eastern Canada." And I was like, "What? Like, where is that?" I had no clue. But seconds later, he said, "But we're pretty sure they're extinct." And so in just seconds, we went from being like, "Yay, what? No," and just being rendered completely invisible. And that's one of my dear friends, the pastor of Street Church, Pastor Christina Dawson. She's New Chanus, a residential school survivor. She says, "We're like ghosts in our own land." So when I hear the land acknowledgement, it doesn't have to be mine, on my land, and anywhere I am. And especially if I'm in a Christian setting, I'm really happy, because I sit there and I feel like I'm not invisible. I'm not a ghost. I'm a human being. And so it's very important. But it's also, in my mind, the limitations are that people can think that it's the end all be all of reconciliation, whereas it's actually like a first step. And not even yours and mine, but like the first step, a baby's first step, to be celebrated. Yeah, you take some pictures, you're happy about it, but it's that baby's first step in the lifetime journey of reconciliation. We have a lot more to talk about, and today we just heard another 182 more unmarked graves found here in Cranbrook on the Tanaka Nation. And so we have a lot more to talk about.
Thank you so much. Geraldine, do you have ideas to add?
Yes. So I'm joining you from Treaty 6 territory in the traditional homeland of the Métis. And strongly believe as a settler Canadian that land acknowledgements are important first step in reconciliation, as Cheryl mentioned earlier. They recognize the oral history that precedes colonization and the stories that this land holds. And also I like the term land acknowledgement as opposed to territorial acknowledgement, because land acknowledgement in my mind recognizes the very unique relationship Indigenous peoples had with the land as one of their relations and the ways in which all things are interconnected. I think that land acknowledgements are very significant in the context of Mennonite history in Canada. There are many Mennonite congregations whose parishioners were settled on land that was taken away from land agreements. So we have communities in Saskatchewan where land was originally set aside as a reserve, and then the people were displaced and the land was sold to settlers. So there's a very significant need to understand that relationship to the land and the place that settlers, the ways in which settlers displaced the original inhabitants. I think in that first step of reconciliation, it's really important to name the land that you are on and the treaty name the original inhabitants of the land that you're on and the treaty that took place there, or whether or not it is unceded territory. And put a couple of links to the Indigenous Atlas of Canada and Whose Land, which are great places to find out what land you're on. I think the danger of land acknowledgements is they become rote. If I look at academic institutions across Canada, every single one of them has a land acknowledgement that is supposed to be read at every single thing. And so there's no sense of this being a commitment to reconciliation. I think a land acknowledgement calls us to that commitment of recognizing displacement and cultural destruction, of living into right relationship, and committing to righting the wrongs of the past.
Thank you, Geraldine. So this brings up a lot of emotions when we say land acknowledgements and deal with the guilt of knowing that our ancestors settled on unceded land or received land that had been recently taken away. Andrea, you've talked about the emotions of anti-racism work, and I wonder if you could speak to how we can attend to the broad range of affect and emotion in this work. How can we acknowledge and lament past harms, but also have a celebratory approach to the dignity of all people? And what's the significance of attending to all of these broad range?
Yeah. First of all, when I'm in counseling, my counselor talks about quails going up, right? We hear things that make our quails go up. And I think anti-racism stuff has made a lot of our congregants' quails go up. For whatever reason, it feels sometimes threatening, right? It means that something about the way that we do things is going to have to change. And so our quails go up. And when our quails go up, we have a hard time talking about things, whether it is on our relationship with our partner, with ourselves, with God, with our own congregation, with our pastor. It doesn't matter who it is with. If our quails are up, it's going to be hard to talk about things, right? And so the issue is that if our quails are up because we've said anti-racism worship, it's going to be tough. But what do we mean by anti-racism worship? Well, the thing is, worship should be anti-racist, period. There's no other way to really put it. if that is hurting people's feelings, we really need to look at why is that. Because when we think about God and why we are worshiping, we really think about God in a way of worship that shouldn't be anti-racist. So that is the first thing that I want to say. Why are your quails going up? Because we are trying to worship in a way that is explicitly anti-racist. So now, the way that we've done worship is been mostly, in the States, in Canada, mainly very Western, white, controlled, right? And musically, in liturgy, traditionally. And so when we talk about Indigenous people weren't able to bring their language into this new faith that they were presented with, African people weren't able to bring their music and their language into this tradition that they were introduced with. All sorts of different people weren't permitted to indigenize the faith. That's a problem, right? And that's kind of what we are trying to correct by saying, let's make worship anti-racist. We're not trying to deny people of their style of worship. We are trying to indigenize to what people's traditions have historically been denied of doing, right? So we are trying to respect the dignity of all peoples rather than upholding just one tradition over all of the others. So it is more about focusing on, okay, why am I feeling this way? Can I really think about myself? Why am I not able to talk about this at church? Why am I feeling uncomfortable? Or doing that as a whole church, why are we having such a hard time allowing other traditions, other forms of worship, other songs, other drums, other instruments, other vocalizations to be included, and allow being comfortable with the indigenizing of Christianity that doesn't look like the traditional, right? Western, and that we are calling anti-racist. But it's really trying to uphold other people's ability to call the faith their own. So thinking about faith in those terms.
Yeah, and so I understand you pastor a predominantly white Mennonite church. Can you talk about how you try to do this in your situation, and maybe specifically how do you engage in Spanish worship resources or in songs when there are not any or few native speakers other than yourself?
It's very interesting because the church that I am a part of has a very, very strong choir tradition. And in choir, as you know, Latin, French, I mean, all those things are just part of, what you do. And oddly enough, one of the choir directors got this idea that for the Christmas cantata, that this was completely on his own. One year, they were gonna do a Christmas program in Spanish. it was just part of, you know, part of the diversity of the choir repertoire, right? And it was exciting, except that Christmas I was going to be in Mexico. So, but I think part of what allows that to happen is that that congregation, Sergeant Avenue Mennonite Church, has always been able to hold on to their history. And when you're able to hold on to your history, you realize that holding on to people's history is important, and allowing that it is a gift that not everybody is granted, right? And they used to have a German hymn, or they used to have a German service, or the service used to be in German, and then it was narrowed down to a German service. And now the compromise is that every Sunday there is a German hymn, to remember that this congregation was born out of German speakers. And that is part of the bulletin too, remembering the history that this congregation was born out of German speakers that emigrated to Canada. And remembering that history, that struggle, that gift of song, of history, I think is one of the abilities that gives this congregation to be able to connect to, okay, history, song, language is important for peoples. And when you take that away, it's very difficult for peoples to continue to hold their stories, their dignities, their cultures. And so the ability to be able to pass this on to generations, to remember, for old people to still be able to have this is very important. So I don't really think that it's necessarily a gift to me that they do. You know, when we sing in Spanish, I think that it is an appreciation of just the language, the diversity that there is in the body, and that comes from their own. You know, being able to sing in German once a week or whenever it is possible.
Yeah, that's great to remember, that recognizing many cultures does not mean that you're losing your own, but actually it's a way to find connections. That's wonderful, thanks. Tony, can you talk about what you've observed about white Mennonite worship in your lifetime and career, and how might white Mennonites be enriched by learning about worship practices and habits from other cultures, and how might whiteness be decentered through new worship practices? And you'll need to unmute.
Sorry, in the mid-70s, I had a chance to travel to what was then the Soviet Union. I was 26 years old, something like that. And I discovered that the Russian Mennonites, that they had within their souls a sense of melancholy, but they had a deep and abiding sense of mysticism. And I connected with them in really profound ways, because my people are a people of struggle, and they had been persecuted and were also a people of struggle. The 21st century Mennonite is not so connected to a sense of struggle. And the 21st century Mennonite is very likely educated and privileged. This has implications for how we worship, I believe. The Mennonite worship, as I've experienced it, is often a left brain experience. And that is not a pejorative thing. It's just a statement of fact. It is often linear, and we write it all down, and then we follow it in some logical sequence. It's conceptual, it's rational, it's controlled. There wouldn't be a lot of what we would call emotionality in these services. And if they are present, you can't see it. Somebody's feeling it internally, but they would never get up, generally speaking, and speak out of an emotional place. So that is very specific. It's very, very Germanic. It's very Swiss, and it's a wonderful tradition. But it has its limitations, just like any denomination would have, because there isn't the freedom. There isn't the freedom to move. There isn't the freedom to clap unless one does it as an exception to a general rule. Therefore, it feels a little bit contrived, but we will do it because we were asked to do it. So I do think that Voices Together, and I like the title because I think of it as something that's global. And so Voices Together, through Voices Together, through the music and through the worship book that you put out, we can sing each other's songs. We can worship in different worship styles. And we can learn a tremendous amount from each other in that process. We can get to the place where we can have empathy, not only for each other's struggles, but for each other's music, each other's culture. This is the hope, and so I think there's an awful lot available for the traditional Mennonite to learn from opening up. I was at a Presbyterian church a couple of weeks ago, and I was impressed when I learned that the congregation there was learning Spanish because they wanted to be open to all of what's in the community, and Spanish is an important big part of that. And as a way of building solidarity, they were studying Spanish. I think, quite honestly, that there should never be a church service that where there is not a song from another culture. That needs to be like the bare minimum, so that we can begin to build relationship, build empathy, and connect to each other's realities through music and through worship. And that's just just the bare minimum. I think there was another question you asked me, and I don't.
Well, I'll follow up specifically about African American songs.
Oh yes, that's it.
You were on the Hymnal Worship Book Committee in the 1980s, and
Yes,
there was African American music in that hymnal. Have you seen a change or a shift in the way that Mennonites have engaged in African American music since then?
I think I was thinking about this in preparation for this gathering, but I remember the hymn book that came out in 1927. It was called the Church Hymnal. There was nothing there, but I remember it very well. And then I remember the Mennonite hymnal, and there were some songs there that came from other cultures, and one of which was my culture, "Lord, I Want to Be a Christian in My Heart," which was wonderful. And then there was the hymnal that I worked with, the worship book, the hymnal worship book. And there was Lift Every Voice and Sing. Wow, that was that was our national anthem. And then I began to experience people singing it, you know, in various congregations that traveled around, and that always made me feel good because there was some acknowledgement of my people and their struggles and their determination and their statement, maybe hopefully, of their affinity to that struggle or their identification with that struggle as a way to identify, I guess, in some way. I would say that from my own personal experience, very subjective, that there are more African American songs sung now than there was 15, 20 years ago. And some of that is because we have access to them. But I would always say there could be more. That's subjective too. There could be more. But you know, there could be more of all of this music from around the world and from our own country. I loved that song that came out in the Mennonite hymnal that was a Native American song, "Father God, You Are Holy," which was never played with drums, but it should have been because it just takes it to another level when it's done that way. We could do a lot better. And the thing is, we don't have to do it. And that means that, you know, we don't really have to. So, but I think if a person wants to be allied with other Christians from around the world, then one would want to sing their songs. There's something quite profound about that.
Yeah, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So this is a good point that there could be more of everything in Voices Together. We know that as we were assembling Voices Together, we knew that it would be used primarily by congregations that are mostly white and English speaking. There are Mennonites of many cultures who do not use a hymnal, white and non-white and many languages, and Voices Together doesn't include enough of any other language for it to be a primary resources. For example, the language other than English in Voices Together that is that most highly represented is Spanish, with about 49 songs, I believe, and 49 songs is not enough for a Spanish-speaking community to use Voices Together as its primary resource. So Voices Together is a start, but if a community wants to go deeper into any culture, they need to look elsewhere. So I'd like to ask Melissa, as a pastor of a predominantly white English-speaking congregation that uses Voices Together. And also, I wanted to point out that the description that Tony gave of white Mennonite worship is a very particular kind of white Mennonite. There is a great variety of worship we should acknowledge across the Mennonite church, but I believe, that type lines up with hymnal using congregations that want it written down. We want to be able to hold a book and have all of our 700 songs right here, and it's all, I think you said it's written down and then we follow it. So I'll turn it over to Melissa now to talk about how can pastoring one of these hymnal using churches, how does anti-racist work and worship work, and how do they intersect in your community?
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, I'm actually going to end up picking up one of the questions from a panelist about cultural appropriation. Wanted to start off talking a little bit about that, because I think as a majority white congregation, that's something that is always at the forefront of our mind when we're interacting with music and resources from other cultures. And so just to give you a sense of how we talk about cultural appropriation, how I think about it in my context, and then welcome other panelists at some other time to jump in if they have more to say. But cultural appropriation, it means that the dominant culture, in the US context, the white culture that I'm a part of, uses the work of another culture without assigning credit without respecting the intent of the work or benefiting from that work in a way that the original culture did not. Oftentimes that can be monetary. I think in the church, those differences between shared cultural materials and cultural appropriation, like in other places, is really power. Who has the power to control what this speaks into the community? But that, I think, has a particular shape for us as the church, in a way that is especially significant. So I wanted to offer one way to understand what's happening in shared worship resources between racial, ethnic, and cultural groups and majority white congregations like mine. I think of these resources as gifts that we receive and gifts that we give. The majority white church is being given a gift. And one thing that we know that gifts do is they create bonds. We become bound together through sharing one another's gifts. If we don't honor the one who is given the gift, the giver, then we're poor stewards of that gift. If we're not grateful to the giver for that gift, we mistreat the gift. We can begin to act like it is our possession instead of what it is, which is actually a gift that we've received. In our church, I think of songs and prayers as great gifts that have traveled to us. And when they do, we become bound to the communities who sent them because we have decided to receive them. We receive them by singing, by enjoying them. Our lives become bound to the givers of those gifts. So worship actually has surprise something to do with our lives. It shapes our whole reality. If we as a church received a gift of Black gospel songs, we are bound up in the flourishing of Black people. If we receive the gift of Korean art, we are bound to confront anti-Asian violence in our communities. If we receive gifts from Indigenous communities, we are pulled into solidarity over water rights. And so I think a question that majority white churches can ask is, how do I honor the bond that this gift creates? And that can be a really helpful orientation for us moving beyond possession or taking advantage or appropriation into thinking about who are the communities, the givers of these gifts.
Yeah. Another caution I've heard is that the idea of how we benefit in a church situation, we don't typically, song leaders don't typically benefit monetarily, but one way that we can be aware of is prestige. So that as a song leader, I shouldn't just choose a song because it will make me look more intelligent or thoughtful or whatever. I need to be thinking beyond what this does for my image or what this does for the image of my congregation. Do any of the other panelists want to jump in about appropriation versus respect versus anything else, Cheryl?
Sure. So I've written some music and I have a few albums, and I have people reach out to me now and again, different worship leaders, and they ask, permission, can I use this in church? And I'm always just like so happy, like, yes, please. And it is tricky if you don't have an Indigenous person who has a hand drum to sort of use the hand drum for the song. But it's, yeah, so that's where it's kind of maybe crossing the line. I don't know. But it's, I'm glad that there's another friend of mine, a Mohawk from Tyendinaga territory, Jonathan, who has some really good songs that they're just great in churches. And you can use, well, I was gonna say a rattle, but I guess that it's another thing. Please don't use a tambourine. No tambourine.
Could I stop you for just a second? We have a Jonathan Miracle song in Voices Together. Sarah, can you look that up and put it in the chat, and then I'll let you keep going, Cheryl.
That's awesome. Thank you for that. So, but one of the things I wanted to say is that in most churches that I walk into, and this is every denomination, and I've worked over the last 25 years in every single denomination imaginable, and in most of the churches, I never feel anything that touches my Indigenous soul. So nothing that I see, none of the artwork, none of the music, none of the, it's all not about me. And I find myself continuing to have to acquiesce to whiteness in all of those spaces. And I'm not sure what the answer is to this. I feel like maybe the only answer is to create Indigenous spaces where we can have our artwork, our musical instruments, our way of singing and worshiping, dancing, and give the leadership over to Indigenous people to indigenize it. In other words, to decolonize it, because we have a lot of decolonization that has to happen in our churches and with our Bible, with the way the Bible was weaponized against the Indigenous people. So there's a lot of work to do, and I appreciate this forum being able to say these kind of things. So thank you.
Other comments on appropriation? Maybe a question that could follow that for Geraldine, from a white person's perspective, from a settler perspective, do you have ideas about why what Cheryl just described about why white Mennonites are unable to or have not embraced Indigenous music as they have some other global songs?
I've been thinking about that one a lot, and I'm speculating. I have a few ideas as to why it might be. I think that one of the things that is very closely tied to colonialism is that Indigenous ceremony was made illegal under colonization in Canada. And so ceremony really went underground. And then I also think that it was described as pagan. And so all of these very negative attributes were given to Indigenous ceremony and Indigenous song, which was very closely associated with ceremony. And so I was thinking about, I spent most of my life in Canada on various Indigenous lands, and where did I hear Indigenous music? In movies, and that was never a good thing in a movie, or at powwows, which were a very, very specific event that had no association with church. And I think about some of the other global music that's come into our repertoire, and I think that our familiarity with the African-American spiritual made the acceptance of African music easier. We were used to the call and response, those kinds of rhythms, where and I think some of this can be applied to Asian music as well, which had a different rhythm, different tonal system, felt very foreign. And so didn't come into our canon in the same way that music out of Africa came into our canon, or Spanish music, which follows much more the European melodic lines. And that I don't think people were worried about appropriating culture at that point in time, but I think in many ways the culture was not accessible. And I think I spent 14 years living in Indigenous communities, worshiping in an Anglican church that was in, the predominant language was in Nunavut, and the entire hymn book were translated hymns from the European tradition. What a friend we have in Jesus, how great thou art, all of that. But I think about the music of the Inuit, one is the drum grounds it, but it was each song was a story. It wasn't It was a story that was told over and over, and it was a story. It might have, it's the story of a person whose story was being retold through the generations. So it's a very, very different kind of song than we're used to within the within the hymnotic tradition. I also think that we kind of I've accused people of sort of collecting the exotic, and North American Indigenous wasn't exotic enough. We have too many other stereotypes associated with it and all of those kinds of things. And then the connection of so much of that music to ceremony and to sacred spaces that we are not invited into because they are not our spaces. And I think that also comes into where appropriation comes to play, is when we take, when any group takes music from a sacred space and uses it in another space without understanding the significance of the song, without understanding the significance of the ceremony, without being tied to the ceremony, that is really problematic.
Yeah,
Cheryl,
true.
I appreciate what you had to say, Geraldine. You brought up another thing in when you talk about Indigenous people singing songs or singing hymns that have been translated into Indigenous languages. That's always, it's always lovely to sing in the language. But one of the things I heard from a professor one time was that, you know, when the gospel has taken root amongst the people, when they start to sing, to write songs in their own language and in their own way, in their own style. And I think that that's really important. There was an Indigenous woman from the Crow Agency, and I don't know how to say their name in their Absoluk, I think it's in their language, but her name is Pretty Eagle, Nellie, I think, Pretty Eagle, and she wrote all these hymns, and now they're called the Crow hymns, and they're her original songs, and that to me is something worth investing in. So if there's Indigenous leadership and language, it's also could be language revitalization, but and then theology, like bringing some good theology. Because another thing, I appreciate what you said, Geraldine, as well, but to be just gut-wrenchingly honest, racism was poured into the foundation of Canada and the United States from the very beginning. Document of Discovery and Manifest Destiny. We have always been seen as evil. We've always been seen as heathens and Canaanites to be cleared away. You know, when smallpox came, they said it's God's will. You know, and to me that's horrific. It's to think in those kind of terms, but that's in the psyche of Canadians and Americans. Nobody ever thinks of Indigenous land, and it's just like, yeah, that's a community. It's always the mission field. It's always less than. And so there's constantly this looking down, and that's why the music has not been generally acceptable, because it's always seen as demonic, and we're sort of those heathens in some ways. So lots of work to do.
Cheryl, do you have particular encouragements or cautions for white Mennonites about engaging in songs and worship resources with connections to Indigenous communities?
Yes, I would say absolutely. One of the main things is keep it tied to the land and the people. And so, and also nothing about us without us. So if you're talking about Indigenous folks, or you want to have like, you know, whatever, just make sure that there's Indigenous people that are the focus. Make sure that our voices are heard and raised. And that's becoming more, and invest in, as I said, Indigenous leadership, because of the residential schools, Indian boarding schools that were started in the United States. They were not education, they were about eradication, and so we didn't get an education. So it's time to reinvest in that and build that up.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to talk about appropriation? let's go back to the question for Melissa about how, and I say back to because when Andrea was talking about connecting with histories, I'm thinking again about the feeling that people get that their culture is being threatened or diminished through diversity. How can we deal with that in our congregations? How can we help people understand and experience anti-racism and diversity as a gain rather than a loss?
I think that it's feeling threatened feels like a little bit harder to answer than sort of the recognition of diminishment of one's own cultural context. One of the ways that I think that we can offer to majority white congregations, sort of shifting that, is to focus on the abundance of what is available to us, that we're actually expanding. There's 52 Sundays in a year. There are hymn sings, retreats, Sunday school classes. There's all of these opportunities for us to sing and worship together. There are abundant opportunities for us to share more deeply. And I think that there can be, this can also be an opportunity for us to talk about the stories, the cultures, the people, again, the givers of these gifts, as we're introducing these music, so that they become, so that the giver is in full frame for us, rather than this just being a new song that we have to get used to. So I know that one of our worship leaders, Rosine Rohr, is just excellent at this. It seems like every time she introduces a song from that we haven't sung before, that's from a new culture, that comes from a different language that not most of us speak, she's done some research on it, and she tells us about who these people are and why, how they're connected to us or to the hymnal. She's very careful that we pronounce the words correctly. She puts the time in to really make sure that we're honoring the words that are being said. And so that changes it, I think, for our congregation from just something that we have to get used to, oh wow, each of these songs comes to us with a history to it, with culture and land and people connected to it, that remind us of the vastness of this grace of shared communion of worship, rather than being restricted to the things that we feel comfortable with and always know. And then, of course, introduce things slowly, just as I know that's always, I'm always tempted to want to just sing all the new songs, and our worship leaders just remind me that to take it slowly, a little bit at a time, and to build a new canon. Canons are always growing. The very last thing I'll say is, a lot of people in our congregations have songs that are significant to them. Sometimes we call them heart songs. We play a game called Hymn Tag in the summer at our church, where someone picks a song and shares the story of their own life about why that song is significant to them. And then they tag someone else in the congregation who shares next week. And we do that the whole summer. And that's changed the way that we understand our worship and what it means for our communal life. So we've found that to be helpful as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. We want to hear from those of you who are listening in to this call. I'll come to you in 1 second, Andrea. So if you have a question that you want to ask, something that's been percolating as you've been listening to this, or a question that you came to this panel with, feel free to put that in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to some of those as well. But over to you, Andrea.
Well, Tony had shared that he had visited a Presbyterian church, if I remember correctly, that was learning Spanish to connect to the community around them. And I think that is wonderful. I mean, relationship plays into that. It doesn't just affect, worship isn't stagnant, right? It goes beyond the doors, the walls of the sanctuary. And so, you know, when we think about what kinds of languages, what kinds of things are we adding to our worship, they don't only have to affect what happens within the walls, but also what happens in the mind, right? If you want to be completely selfish about why you're engaging in different kinds of content for worship, practicing different languages has incredible benefits to your brain. I mean, you know, we learn about doing Sudoku and those kinds of things. Learning words in different languages, practicing those things also has incredible benefits. And if you do it day in and day out, like, you know, if you're not just doing it on Sunday, maybe you also doing you know, during the week, during choir practice, maybe you are getting together with a church group to practice a specific language, or maybe it is several. You wanna really learn a particular song, the words, and you're practicing those words, the specific pronunciation. That has benefits. That delays, you know, like early onset dementia, early onset Alzheimer's, like those kinds of things. So if you want to engage in it for completely selfish reasons, God's creation is wonderful. We were meant to engage beyond our own selves, and this is sort of proof for that. Why? Because it benefits us beyond you know, what we may think. Learning other languages, engaging in songs beyond our own has benefits. So that, I mean, that is an encouragement.
Thank you so much. Yes. I wonder if we can switch gears a little bit to talking about the language we use in worship as that relates to anti-racism. For example, Tony Brown, you wrote a document about darkness and light imagery for the Hymnal Worship Book Committee. So I wonder if you can start by talking a little bit about how the images we use in worship connect to the work of anti-racism. And then if any of the other panelists want to jump in after Tony, you can do so.
Well, I always had a jolt within me when I was singing various hymns that always connected darkness with sin. And you know, one can extrapolate, and that actually both consciously and unconsciously could be a reflection of myself as a dark person. So I did do a study of all of the hymns in the Mennonite hymnal, and the numbers there that had dark in a negative, and I think it was very well received, at least by several of the people that were on the committee. It was very well received, but it didn't it didn't bring any results, because the one of the members said it's biblical. And that just shut everybody up. So that was pretty much the end of that. But I do believe that our language, as you point out, is very, very important in how we use language, and how it can demean and offend. And we need to be very careful as we seek to be anti-racist about our language. And there's so many subtleties with this, so many. I mean, and it's not just black and sin. I mean, it's in almost every disempowered culture. The language often is a negative language that relates to us. Something to be consciously aware. And I think we can help each other too. I mean, I never hesitate to kindly say things to people when I feel like it was offensive. And we have to be able to do that and be willing to do that if we're going to do this work. If we're going to be the church, we have to.
Well, Mr. Brown, that may not have been as effective for the hymnal committee, but it has been incredibly impactful on my life and career, because I knew about that work that you did and work to commission Joyful as the Dark.
Yes, well, that was one. Yes, that was a positive thing that came out of that. Brian Wren read that paper, and then and he visited with me, and out of that he wrote that song, which was very wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, it's my favorite hymn. So thank you for writing that paper.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and to say that, you know, we have found that teaching from you very important for our congregational life. We are incredibly attentive to darkness and light language. We did an Advent series once following the images of darkness as holiness in Brian Wren's hymn. And so just to also want to publicly thank you, because even though it may not have affected the hymnal committee, it significantly affected my church. And
I think it affected this hymnal project. So,
yes,
you know, everything in its own time. But that's great. Thank you.
I'll say that on the Voices Together committee, we said that not every biblical image, number one, is something we need to sing about. And number two, there are biblical images that we need to treat very carefully. And it doesn't mean, so if anyone hears that argument, well, it's biblical, we don't need to talk about it.
Yeah.
There are still things that we need to treat with care and that we need to think about.
Be careful. Yes. Yes.
We have a great question here in the Q&A. So I'll just read it out here. What role does diverse representation in leadership play in anti-racist worship? And can the panelists give some guidance on recruiting and including diverse leadership without falling into tokenism? So maybe I'll throw this over to Andrea to start, and if anyone wants to jump on after that.
I was gonna jump in. I think it is very important to be prepared if you are willing and open to diversify your staff, to actually listen to that staff once they're on. Because what often happens is that you want the staff to look diverse, but you want that staff person to comply to the system and the order that is there. And as Tony mentioned, and I know Katie clarified that not all Mennonite churches look the same, but most of the Mennonite churches that I worked at do follow that Swiss, German, Russian, very structured, like being on time, you know, like having their bulletin printed, and that is wonderful. Like, for the most part, I love working within that system. However, I also bring in my own culture, my own gifts, my own style, and I like the freedom to be my own person and represent the culture and the person that I am. And a lot of the expectations that I were set for staff don't take into account that cultural diversity that the person is bringing. Why? Because when you've worked with a primarily or really an only white staff for as long as there has been a church, you've never had to get used to someone bringing that diversity in. And so someone not complying to that just seems like a bad worker. right? Just seems like they're not quite fitting in. They're not quite doing what they're supposed to be doing. And after a while, it seems like this is not working out. And I'm not saying that, oh, I'm feeling like, it's time to move on necessarily, but I know that for many people of color, that has happened where they get to a place and they just are not able to really feel like they were hired for their gifts. They were hired for the tokenism, the facade of the diversity, right? So, and I've shared this before, this little story, and so I'll give you a little kind of window of what I'm talking about. One time I showed up to preach at a church, and it was 5 minutes before the service, and the lead pastor was running around looking for me, and they were all worried because it's 5 till the service starts. And I say, yeah, I'm printing my sermon. And they're like, you're only printing your sermon now? I'm like, what are you talking about? I have 5 minutes. And they're like, you're printing your sermon now? I'm like, I have 5 minutes. I feel like I'm early. Now, am I late? In my head, I still have plenty of time. In their head, I'm late. And I seem like the most irresponsible person because I'm only printing my sermon 5 minutes before the service starts. And it is this kind of interactions that can make a person like me feel like I can't function in this place because I am constantly being looked at as a failed staff. I'm not meeting the expectations. I'm not being trusted to get the job done. So I'd say it doesn't have to be tokenism. So don't make it feel like it.
Thank you for that story. And that really gets at the heart of decentering whiteness. I mean, what you're saying, what I hear you saying is that the other staff are centering whiteness and expecting you to come to that center. And I wonder if others have a comment on framing it that way. How can we decenter whiteness in order to allow more leaders of color? Cheryl.
Well, one of the things, I love your story, Andrea. I've experienced that a lot myself. And I used to be in a leadership meeting where they would start right on time every time, and then people would always be coming in. A couple of people might have to like shove by, to get on the boardroom table, and it was always awkward. And we're in the meeting, and it's like, oh. So one time I told the president, I was like, Indigenous people, we're usually on time. We like to be on time. Of course, you can't like stereotype that we're always late, whatever. I have elders who are like early for everything, but Indigenous people, as a general rule, and this is what I hear from you, Andrea, is that we value relationship over agenda. So you don't start until everybody's here, and that's a very high value, and so I appreciate that story. I forgot what else I was going to say. Was there another? Maybe I'll just pass it.
Oh, Tony, were you going to add something?
I was just going to say, as it relates to Andrea's story, that as lonely as that might feel, that it's an opportunity for a teachable moment. That you bring something that they don't have, and you're in this position of, unfortunately, but maybe fortunately, having to let them know you contextually in your culture and your background. That's a way for them to think about reality in more than just their own way. So you have a big job there, and hopefully there are people around you who who understand you and who can support you.
I remember what I was going to say because of Tony's talk. Can I was going to just say that there's a great book by Sherwood Lingenfelder, and it's called Ministering Cross-Culturally. He talks about the Islander culture, which is indigenous. And I just kind of feel like I felt at home in Mexico. I feel at home in Black churches. I just feel that we have this affinity, and of course the Islanders as well. They're indigenous, so there's lots of crossover. But one of the things that they compared time, and they compared how long it takes before indigenous cultures compared to Euro background, Euro American, Euro Canadian cultures, how long it takes when you're late before those people get angry or get like mildly upset. And it was unbelievable. It was like, and I don't remember exactly, but it was something like they'll kind of like get mildly upset for indigenous people if you're like 30 minutes late. They'll get like really angry if you're like 2 hours late or something like that. But if for Euro background cultures, it was like 5 minutes and then 10 minutes or something like that. And that's when there's like that anger. And when I looked at that study, I was just amazed. And then I met some Germans who I talked about this. I was like, what's the deal with being on time or like being early for everything all the time? And they said, oh, and I have some actual relatives of my relatives are some Germans, and they're lovely folks. They're really funny. I'm so grateful for my funny family. But they were like, ugh, everybody else shows up early, so we can't just be early. We have to be earlier than the early ones. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is madness. So there's definitely a learning curve, Tony. Thank you for that. Lots of teachable moments.
Melissa, did you have anything to add on the decentering whiteness and leadership conversation?
Yeah, sure. I think that, as we talk about this in our own majority white congregation, often one of the things we often say is that our first commitment is to deconstructing racism in our majority white church, in our white culture. It isn't to try to bring diversity to our church. If that happens, that's great. And part of that, I think, is the influence of the Black church, the historic Black church in the South, which was formed to be a place where you didn't have to worry about the white gaze, where you could be outside of the daily ins and outs of white supremacy. And so while I have a lot of respect for the hard and difficult work of multicultural, multi-racial churches, I also have a profound respect for the decisions of communities who for them, sanctuary is getting outside of the white gaze. And so we kind of hold those things in balance. But again, our primary work is anti-racism. And we cannot even begin to imagine that we could be a place of sanctuary, a place of refuge or nourishment for people of color, unless we have that work ongoing amongst ourselves first.
Thank you. Here's a question from Peter Wintermote from Heston College. How do white churches better represent the culture and diversity of African American songs? And do you have resources to suggest for how to start entering into that? And I'm going to throw that to Tony.
I know, Peter. Well, we've already got a good resource with this new Voices Together. But one of the things that I have tried to say to a lot of Mennonite pastors is, why not develop a relationship with African American churches in your area? Because I think Peter's question could be best addressed by building a relationship with an African-American pastor or two or three or four. The one doesn't have to do this work in a vacuum. They're all around, and somehow I don't know, we just don't do it. We stay, well, that's been the history, I think. It's just to kind of be aloof from what's going on when the resources are all around there. And of course, the new book has an increasing number of gospel songs and spirituals from the African American tradition, and then there's a host of hymnals from the Black tradition that you can go online and find them, and build up a bank of that music, because it's readily available. But I like the best meeting somebody that's deeply into that music, that's African American, and build a relationship with them and let them take you, let them lead you.
One more question for any of the panelists who want to answer this, and maybe I'll start kind of where, or we'll end where we began a little bit with land acknowledgements too. The question is, what are some markers of cultural appropriation or harmful use of a song? What are markers of appropriate and respectful use? And so Geraldine, at the beginning, you talked about kind of what comes with doing a land acknowledgement and how to do that well. And so I wonder if you can kind of open this up, whether with songs or worship resources, for us on what are markers of harmful and helpful use of resources from many places.
So I think one of the places I start is that the music we choose for worship needs to be appropriate for the worship that we are doing. So we choose music whose lyrics and theology feed into the theme of that worship service. So I think that's a really important part. We don't just throw in a hymn because it's a catchy tune we heard last week at some assembly somewhere, and we want our congregation to learn it. We want that music to speak to the overall experience of worship. And I think that one of the really important things in terms of Voices Together is, and in the conversations we had around the Indigenous music, is the permissions, that we weren't using music that had not been, to use Melissa's language, gifted to us. We weren't just going and collecting songs like a tourist, picking up souvenirs at every stop. We were choosing music that fit our theology and that we had permission to use. So I think that's the really important starting place there. And when you don't do those two things, then you're appropriating and using things inappropriately, in my mind.
Anyone else on cultural appropriation? Kind of, we've already talked about this, but specific indicators of doing it well, or best practices, or things to really try to avoid. Andrea?
When you talk about music, but also the Voices Together has a lot of visual stuff more than other hymnals in the past. One of the things that really bugs me is the appropriation of art that is, for example, indigenous to Mexico or indigenous to communities in Canada, in the States, and that those groups are not, do not benefit. I mean, there's stories of like big fashion companies copywriting patterns from communities all over the world, and that is just disgusting, right? I mean, I can't describe it any other way. And so a lot of times, mindlessly, we decorate our sanctuaries for worship with items, with things, with visuals that we got at stores, not really thinking what the patterns, what the art really, where it really came from, what big company is benefiting, and what Indigenous community it actually was stolen from. I've walked into sanctuaries that have like Indigenous art that they probably bought at a big box store, and it just doesn't really sit well. And so that is one, just being mindful of those kinds of things, because it is part of worship, right? Like when we have Lent, when we have Easter, we like that being part of our space. And so just being mindful of how we adorn our spaces. And in terms of our music, I've also heard of sometimes people jokingly changing up the words and kind of not really pronouncing things right. And it doesn't bother me when people can't actually pronounce things when they're trying to sing. I understand that they're trying, but if they leave and they're making fun of, the language, the song, that is hurtful. Like I don't actually think that is a joke, right? And so changing that mindset of that is actually not funny. I understand that it was a struggle for you to sing the word, and it might have sounded funny. And at that time I can laugh, and it can be sort of like an easygoing moment. But if you keep doing it once we leave, that is no longer funny. Like that is not a joke. Like you're just making fun of the language. And so understanding those lines, right? I understand that it came out of your mouth in a funny way, a funny sound, because you can't sing and try to pronounce a strange word to your vocals. That is understandable. There's nothing wrong with that. You're not going to be judged for that. But if you leave and you keep making fun of that language, that tune, that culture, then it is offensive. It is not a joke, right? So understanding those lines, and why is that offensive? Because the people from that culture can't take that off. You can, as a powerful, white person with privilege, but those people can't. And so it feels like you're mocking them. And that's where privilege comes in, right? You can take it off any moment. For you, it's a joke. For them, it isn't. They can't take it off. They can't take off the skin color. They can't take off the accent. They can't take off the language. And they don't want to. It's something to be proud of, right? And so that's we want to make sure that people understand there's nothing wrong with struggling when you're trying to, but leaving and making fun, that's the line we don't want to cross.
There's a question from a viewer that says, we're a small congregation, a new church plant with no paid staff and no musicians. And it sounds like, to paraphrase, how do we do this with few resources? And they say, do any of you know or have stories of predominantly white church plants doing this well? So especially in a small scale, with few resources, so maybe the other side of this, what can we do on a small scale? there anyone that wants to jump in, or do I need to assign someone? Melissa, do you have an idea? I know you have relationships with church plants, I believe. Is that true?
Yeah. I think I know who this person is too. But yeah, our church is not big. We don't have any paid musicians on staff. That's our worship leaders are a shared gift in our congregation. So certainly identify with that piece of it. And I'm the only full-time staff member. But I do think that there is, as Mr. Brown mentioned, the reaching out to other communities to support you in this work. So for our church, that's through community organizing. We're in relationship with lots of different kinds of churches who we have relationships with now, and that includes the ability to share worship resources. And so I think perhaps for smaller churches, thinking of this as a community-wide effort, and maybe even to create spaces outside of your traditional Sunday worship. Again, recognizing that people may worship in language groups or racial groups for reasons that are insignificant to them, but maybe there are other times to share worship resources in community building that enrich worship for smaller majority white churches.
Thank you. And we are at the end of our time. I hate to cut off this wonderful conversation, but we have another panel coming up, and we will take a break. And I want to first say thank you to the 5 of you for your time and your thoughts and your insights. This was wonderful. And to the viewers, I want to acknowledge, as Andrea said earlier, this can really raise our defenses, and just be aware of how you're feeling. This can be a heavy conversation. It can bring up a lot of feelings. So take this 5 minutes to take a few breaths and let your defenses go down if you feel them up, and just be aware of how you can be open to another conversation. The next panel is going to talk more specifically about Voices Together and more specific songs. If you are from a tradition that doesn't use Voices Together, there are many songs that you might recognize that people will talk about. And we'll have a song that you can listen to and decompress, and we'll see you back in about 5 minutes. Thanks again to our panelists.